Assalamualaikum and welcome to Introduction to Malaysian Literature in English. As mentioned before, this course focuses on Malaysian literature written in English and is meant for students who may not be familiar with such works. But before we go further, it would be good if we look at the introduction of English as a language first to the locals and how it inspires some great works written by Malaysians. To begin with, it was undoubtedly the British who first brought English into Malaya as an effect of colonization. Historically, the British slowly extended their influence over the region, first by acquiring a small island in the northwestern part of the Malay Peninsula, which is Penang, from the Sultan of Kedah in 1786, followed by the seizure of Malacca from the Dutch in 1795. And the signing of Bangkok Treaty in 1874, which ultimately led to the establishment of resident system, which allowed the British to indirectly rule some of the Malay states. In the early days of this indirect rule, English was used among English people, which much simplified version of it with their workers and servants. Because of this, the tradition of literature in English by Malayan started much later. One good paper that explores the development of Malaysian literature in English came from Professor Philip Holden from the National University of Singapore. In his paper, he traced and categorized the development of Malaysian literature into four communities: the street-born, the Malayans, the English-educated, and the cosmopolitans. The first community that produced extensive writing in English was the Straight-born. Publications such as the Straight Chinese Magazine, the Straight Chinese Literary Association Recorder, and the Straight Chinese Annual might seem at first sight to be concerned with the status of the Chinese Peranakan community in the Strait settlements. But they were part of a larger social field of publication, of which was marked by the titles of the Strait Eurasian Advocate and the Indo-Chinese Patriot that attempts to overcome divisions and imagine a shared community. Furthermore, the Straight-born has three key features. First, it is an elite community marked by both a commitment to modernity and an anxiety that this modernity might result in the alienation from a larger Asian society. Secondly, it is a cosmopolitan community cutting across the racialized boundaries of colonial plural society. And thirdly, it is a marginal community that demanded the status of British subjects, the right to bear arms in defense of the colony, and the right for their menfolk to be addressed as Mr. and their womenfolk to be described as ladies. The second community, the Malayans, was a result from the explosion of creativity at the University of Malaya in Singapore from 1949 onwards, and its diffusion outside the university in the years up to 1965. The community itself is perhaps less well understood, and indeed it was in many ways an artificial one. Members of the Singapore Anglophone domicile communities mixed with students from all over Malaya who came from a much wider variety of backgrounds, but both inspired by a common political project, the creation of a Malayan nation. Driven by a broad identification with anti-colonial nationalism, writers in English in this period include the early E. Tian Hong and Wong Pui Nam, Edwin Tambo, Kasim Ahmad, Lloyd Fernando, and Lee Kok Leang. This group again was cosmopolitan, including returned students from overseas and elites, given the restricted access to university education at the time. Despite their social privileges, this was perhaps the time at which English language writers in Malaysia would have felt least marginal, able to identify with various strands of a national narrative that was still in formation. Delineating the boundaries of the third community is more difficult. It includes those Malayan writers who began writing in the 50s and 60s but became Malaysians in 1963 and retained this citizenship after 1965. Some key events took place during this period. Singapore leaving Malaysia in 1965, the National Language Act of 1967, and then the traumatic May 13 incident in Kuala Lumpur in 1969 that resulted in the formation of the new economic policy in 1971 that encourages several bilingual writers to write more in Malay. The remaining community might be called the English educated, where most writers found themselves in a state of exile. For some, this exile became a physical one. E. Tiang Hong migrated to Australia, while Shirley Lim left to the United States. For others, exile was more of a mental state. We can see this in the work of the two finest novelists of the period, Lloyd Fernando and K.S. Maniam. And last but not least came the fourth community, a direct result of social policies from the 1970s onwards. The move to Bahasa Malaysia as the medium of education and the admission policies that resulted in a changed demography of students at Malaysian universities, as well as the rise of a prosperous Malay middle class, have resulted in a community that we might identify as cosmopolitans, middle-class Malaysians who have been educated or who have spent a considerable amount of time abroad. Artists as varied as Karim Raslan, Dina Zaman, Huze Sulaiman and Amir Muhammad have all studied or spent significant periods in an English-speaking environment abroad, while previous generations of Malaysian writers also ventured overseas. This new group is significantly different in a number of ways. First, they are not simply linked to the United Kingdom, but also to other centers of cultural production, the United States, Australia, and also sites in Asia such as Singapore. Secondly, the group is also culturally diverse. Huze, Karim, and Amir, for instance, although nominally Bumiputra, are also culturally hybrid backgrounds and works in a variety of languages.